You there? Can you put this? Is that okay?
Good evening. Доброго вечора. Welcome to Shevchenko Scientific Society. The society is the oldest scientific and cultural institution founded in 1873 in Lviv, Ukraine, and was refounded in the US in 1947. We will celebrate the upcoming 150th year anniversary of the society founded in 2023. We support Ukrainian and international scholars by providing them with grants and opportunities to publish their books. In 2022, the society founded the Shevchenko Emergency Fund, which granted Ukrainian scholars and artists who were displaced by the war. Also, we have library and archives. For more information about society, please reach out to our website and find us on Facebook and Instagram. Tonight, I was pleased that Razum and Shevchenko Scientific Society hosted Professor Olga Onuk with the presentation of her latest book, The Zelensky Effect. Welcome, Katya, who will be the moderator for this event.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Shevchenko Scientific Society, for hosting us. It's a pleasure always to cooperate and as such. And thank you, Professor Olga Onu, for coming here to New York. Razum hosted a similar roundtable with you in DC that was, I heard, hugely successful. And following the success, we appreciate that you agreed to do a separate event for our New York community. I'm Katya Pavlevich. I'm a part of Razum advocacy team, and as many of you noticed, I am not Dora Khomyak, who was announced to moderate the panel. So I'm filling pretty big shoes today. Unfortunately, Dora was called for a very urgent meeting. If you want to learn more details, follow Razum social media pages. I'm sure it will be public soon. I think the audience is pretty familiar with Professor Onuk, but I just want to, for those who are new here, mention a couple quick facts. Olga Onuk is a professor in comparative and Ukrainian politics at the University of Manchester. First ever professor in Ukrainian politics in English-speaking world, I think as of last year, if I'm not mistaken. Olga also is one of the leading experts on Ukraine, both in the UK and internationally. But we came here today to discuss specifically the book by Professor Onuk, The Zelensky Effect, that's been cited and positively reviewed by outlets like Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, Washington Post, and many others. I'll give you a couple minutes to tell a little bit about the book that we all came here to discuss. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you very much for hosting us tonight. And thank you all for coming. So I'm going to start off with just reading you a little vignette first. Why not? Now that I have my fearless, earnest, Russian target number one, the man in the green t-shirt or green jumper, as sometimes the occasion may necessitate. As Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine unfolds in real time on screens worldwide, perhaps on your own very screens and your mobile devices, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has captured the global imagination like no one else, and I'm very certain your own imaginations too. Just 3 years ago, Zelensky was still just a television star, a comedian, whose main qualifications for Ukraine's presidency seemed to be simply having played one on TV. The Kremlin saw him as a pushover, but I was recently in DC speaking with, in fact, at that event, 3 different ambassadors, So did Washington. So did Brussels. In fact, so did many people in Ukraine itself. But yet, rarely has a politician so visibly surprised so many, and I'm sure perhaps some of you in this very room. The man Ukrainians call at times affectionately, at times not quite affectionately, Ze, has come to symbolize the nation's fierce resistance to what many experts initially thought was a military juggernaut on Russia's side. Yet, this full-on Ukrainian mobilization and Zelensky's potential to rally it should have been no surprise. The reason for its and his success is not that he possesses special leadership traits that set him apart from his country. Instead, what makes him so extraordinary in war comes from the very ordinariness that he possesses in Ukrainian and the understanding of ordinary Ukrainians. In fact, and as we argue, he inherits a tradition of dissent and fierce resistance and civic sense of duty that is baked into the country's main identity. That is one that is a civic identity, that is state-bounded, the attachment to the state and its democracy. He is this Ukrainian every person, albeit that very few others could ever possibly be. And in order to understand him and how he came into the presidency, and then how he behaves following February 24th, 2022, you really first have to understand Ukraine's history of civic resistance. And this is where we actually start the book. It might be a surprise to you that this book is not, in fact, a book about Zelensky, quite frankly, almost at all. It is a book about contemporary Ukrainian politics. In fact, the last 3 decades of it. But we start off even before Ukraine's independence. We start off with the late dissident period. And I am thrilled, as a person who studied protest and activism for now nearly 20 years, that Zelensky gave me the opportunity to write a book about him, but because he talks about dissidents so often in his speeches, allowed me to start off the book with this. He was not one that rallied to the civic state first. He was not one that engaged as a young person. In fact, other members of his generation did so repeatedly, whether it was 1991 with the student hunger strike, whether it was Ukraine without Kuchma, Ukraine bez Kuchmy, whether it was Zapravdu, which was the interim mobilization, the Orange Revolution, or the Euromaidan. He rallied for the Euromaidan. He did not come to the rally sooner. The book takes you through the contemporary history of Ukraine. It is based entirely, obviously, on empirical analyses of over 9 years worth of survey data. In fact, I believe it's 12 or 14 surveys that we conducted ourselves with Henry in Ukraine over that course, that period. And most importantly, it's panel data. Therefore, it follows the same individuals over time, allowing us to track important changes among the Ukrainian citizens. The other thing that we use in the book throughout is we use his own words in order to be able to tell you what he's all about. We do a discourse and content analysis of all of his speeches, pre and post the commencement of war, and all of his appearances in The Servant of the People, the show that you might have seen on Netflix, and also all of the songs and theatrical performances. You can imagine this was a very busy time for me and Henry. This was not something we like to watch necessarily, but we found something very intriguing. The man you think changed so much because of the war on February 24th, the persona the world came to know, and in fact many Ukrainians came to know, has been saying the same things for decades. First in his entertainment, albeit not to my taste. Then in the show, which was designed as a mechanism for a political campaign, certainly that last season. And then in his campaign speeches and in his presidential speeches, and what did he talk about repeatedly? He talked about the civic identity that unites all Ukrainians, regardless of what part of the country they live in, regardless of what language they speak. He repeatedly highlights the fact that that which divides Ukrainians is nowhere near as strong as that which unites them. And that which unites them is a sense of civic duty and consistent capacity to engage in politics. And he talks about the dissidents. And he talks about Ivan Zuba. And he talks about Nina Kostenko. He talks about Ivan Zuba because Ivan Zuba was a Russian speaker until his 20s from Donetsk Oblast. He learned Ukrainian in his 20s, and for those of you who might know very well, he wrote an incredibly important and famous treatise against Russian chauvinism and imperialism. But he was also a communist, and he believed so strongly that this eloquently written treatise will move people that he hand-delivered it to the Communist Party office. Now, you and I both know to do that at that time was seemingly crazy. But this is how strongly he believed in the capacity of citizens to change the system. And by highlighting individuals like him, like Ivan Zuba in his speeches, Zelensky brought on to this Euro-Atlanticist, liberal, pro-democratic portion of Ukraine, he brought on a constituency that previously did not see themselves part of it. So what we find in the book is that the Zelensky effect is two things. On the one hand, on the one side of the coin, it is the civic nation that made him the man he is today, and he repeatedly talks about that civic history in his speeches. On the other side of the coin is the very real effect that he had on a key constituency in the southeast, Russophones and Russian ethnic Ukrainian citizens, that perhaps did not feel as strongly included in the Ukrainian civic identity before. But between 2019 and 2022 came to rally to it. In fact, it is these people who voted for Zelensky that moved to holding a pro-democracy position. After 30 years of not supporting democracy, those who voted for Zelensky in 2019 and were, quite frankly, big fans of his and listening to his speeches, came to support democracy at 20% more. If you voted for Zelensky, you were 20% more likely to move to democracy. That is a very real effect. And these people are residing in what became the front lines of the war. And I think that is something that we cannot underestimate. And that is certainly what I think will be the most important thing about Zelensky's presidency. His ability to rally citizens that felt left behind up until 2019.
Thank you very much for a brief overview. You touched so many subjects, topics, and angles of the Zelensky pre and post presidency. One of these notion you introduced in your book is independence generation in Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit more about who are those people? What distinguishes them from the rest? If we were, immediate Ukrainian, how would we identify you're one of them, or what is definitely not you?
They're my age. They're me. People in their 40s. So Zelensky's part of the independence generation, and this is not the generation that was already in their 20s in 91. This is the generation of folks like myself, like Zelensky, like Olesia Ostrovska, for some of you who might know her, like many others, who were between the ages of perhaps 6 and 16 at the time of transition. Certainly old enough to have cognitive awareness of what is happening and the import of the scenes that unfolded, but not being able to do anything about it. also living their teens and early 20s through what we call the wild, wild East 1990s in Ukraine. There was wild privatization, where there was the rise of oligarchs, where things were certainly being done. In Kiev, when I was a child, going with my father to a restaurant, where there were drive-by shootings in certain locations, where people brought guns to tables in fancy restaurants, right? So this generation remembers that, but they also remember the fact that they likely couldn't get a credit to buy a home, or had to get a credit in euros, which they quite frankly could never afford. That many of them would have to pay bribes to go to certain universities if they were lucky enough to have that opportunity. That the towns and villages that they were from were suffering from socioeconomic inequality and poverty. And this is also the generation that repeatedly rallied. It was Volodymyr Vyatrovich, it is many others who joined organized social movements, joined mass protests, and Mustafa Nayem, we can go on, who tried to do things in the system, to try to change and push it forward. They're a diverse bunch. It's not normative, the thing there about them. They're a diverse bunch, and they're not all good necessarily, but they have that very particular political socialization, and they are now in power in almost every major institution.
Thank you. In your book, you also often refer in your speech that we got Zelensky wrong. We got him wrong. Everybody got him wrong. My question is, did we get him wrong, or did he change? For me, Zelensky before and after invasion, it's kind of two different men. One is much more stressed than another one. But you point out to the idea that he's always been like this. What are your arguments?
Well, there's many arguments to this, and there's many empirical facts and details, and they're all in the book. That was a surprise to us ourselves. In 2019, I'm a political scientist, professor. I know a lot about Ukrainian politics. I am Ukrainian. Many of the people I just spoke about, they are my friends, colleagues, people I've worked with. In 2019, and my family comes from the 25%. In 2019, I did not fully understand the appeal. I did not understand what people were hearing in the messaging of Zelensky personally, right? My job is to do the analysis. My job is to study people and what they think and how they vote and why they protest and so on and so forth. And Natalia Gumanyuk, also a member of the Feminist Generation, like, Olyo, you will have to rewatch the show, whether you like it or not. And you will have to now watch all of the concerts. And you will now have to, and so on and so forth. She gave me a list of the things I had to do. And my goodness, was she right. This was right after the presidential election. And I started seeing in those very things that because you turned away from them, myself speaking, because you didn't pay attention to the messaging, I was really surprised by how much about the war there was in these concerts, by how much there was about regaining Crimea, by how much there was about supporting the army, by how much there was about political and social inequalities in the country, mixed in with a whole bunch of other stuff, of course. But how much there was about the duty of ordinary citizens to engage. And in his inauguration speech, in fact, Zelensky talks about that ordinary citizens can be part of the problem if they do not engage in politics, if they engage in corruption. That it's not only, although very strongly, importantly, oligarchs' systemic problems, but that ordinary citizens' role in political society is very important. And that's a message that he has been repeatedly saying throughout. The other thing is, I think it's very important to note that this just a comedian, just an actor trope, it was used during the presidential elections by Poroshenko in order to do something. Because this was this man was very popular, he was embedded in elite networks, and he had a direct channel of communication to citizens, which Henry and I do say in the book that we find problematic, and in fact, electoral laws might have to be changed in the future to not have a president have his own show on television during the campaign and after the silent period of the campaign starts as well. But it is exactly this that people missed. He was not an actor, comedian, Firstly, he was the general producer of the most important, largest, and most popular television network, not channel, network in Ukraine, in that is the equivalent of being the general producer, not of Fox News, but of Fox Network. This was an insider. This was an elite player. I'm waiting for investigative journalists to write that story, because there will surely be something interesting there. This was a person who was very clever in that job, and he separated himself from the news production element in order to keep a safe distance. But in fact, he knew many of these oligarchs that he makes fun of later in his show by first name, and quite frankly, that short version of the name that we all know, right? So this was a quite important power player in the Ukrainian elite, and he was offered a position by Poroshenko in the party list in 2014, 2019 as well. He was also offered the opportunity to be a governor. So this is the Zelensky that people miss, both what he was saying, perhaps in a way that we didn't like, and the fact that he was actually quite a capable manager and leader. And that didn't change over time. It was revealed to us.
Thank you. Since we're in New York, I remember the elections of 2019 in San Francisco, where I used to live, and there's a 9-hour difference, and I was volunteering in the election poll, and I showed up when, frankly, Ukraine has decided already. Nevertheless, large diaspora in California still showed up to vote, and it was quite a striking difference how basically 70% of Ukrainians voted for Zelensky and 70% of American diaspora voted for Poroshenko. It was very different. Does the independence generation translate into diaspora, into people who've left or never been actually to Ukraine, but who have ethnical background in Ukraine? Does the independence generation exist among us here?
Well, I mean, we can say it does, but no, because it's that lived experience, specifically of the 1990s, that makes those individuals different. It's it's being a part of the political society, but not being able to take direct action within it. It's watching your parents struggle, but not being able to do anything about it. It is an experiencing those early 20s and perhaps 30s of, quite frankly, what was not an easy go for a lot of these individuals. And I think they are very different from the generation that comes right after them, because the generation that comes right after them actually has no living memory of living under authoritarianism, right? They also probably don't have a living memory of those 1990s, that period, right? They may have a living memory of the Orange Revolution. And the generation that comes before them that was able to directly benefit from that wildness of the 1990s. There were people who were able to make incredible careers, fortunes, because of the chaos that was unfolding. That is not the lived experience of a person in the diaspora that grew up in San Francisco or in Toronto or in New York. And why it's not surprising that the diaspora voted differently. In fact, we measured this as well in our studies of the Mobilize project, of which the data is predominantly used in the book, because they weren't watching the same shows. They weren't looking at Zelensky's Instagram pages. They certainly weren't attending the concerts. They didn't have an intimate knowledge of this man that millions of Ukrainians saw every single day on their television. Running a political satire show. And they probably have a good memory of Jon Stewart, but not of Zelensky at the time.
Thank you. We'll start accepting questions, and from the registered people, we have the first question, which is, do you think Ukrainian people will fight differently if Ukraine is under another president?
No. And I say that both as a Ukrainian and a social scientist, and if Henry was here, who has no Ukrainian background, he would say no as well, I think. The whole main message in the book is that Zelensky becomes who he is, and the president that he is, because of the Ukrainian people. We often say the country is 44 million Zelenskys that may or may not like him at all and may or may not have anything in common with him personally. But it is a country that, when faced with tanks, elderly people tried to stop them with their bare hands. This is not something that is unique to one individual. I don't know what a different president would have done. And political scientists don't talk about coulda, woulda, shouldas. But I do not think the Ukrainian people would fight any different.
Thank you. I personally have a lot of questions. I think this conversation could go on and on, but I think there is a lot of interest on the audience. If you have a question, please raise a hand and let's talk about books, Zelensky, or many other Professor Honors interests. If no questions, I have 10. Yes, I can see a hand, but very shy one.
As American, you see a lot of Zelensky as commander of chief. But what are some of his domestic policies he's trying to pursue during the war? We don't really hear about that.
I mean, it's not so much just him, but it's his party and his ministers, and there's we should stop just looking at Poroshenko. We should stop looking just at Poroshenko as well, but we should stop looking at just Zelensky individually. The main policy platform hasn't changed, quite frankly, since his election. So one of the biggest mistakes that people who have said they have studied his campaign, but really truly have shown not to, is the content of that campaign. And this is something that Henry actually is feels very strongly about, so he would be better at answering that here right now. The key things, obviously, ending the war was a major campaign element, and that still remains one currently, but we're talking about other domestic politics. Dealing with corruption. And there are certain things that have been done to try to deal with corruption, specifically trying to limit the power of oligarchs, trying to limit the control that they have over the media sphere. Some of those policies or the way they were enacted may or may not be entirely liberal, but they may be necessities of the war context. Another element to this is the eradication of deputy immunity. The fact that deputies in the parliament, the Rada, they had immunity, and they could not be charged for various acts of corruption that they took part in certain periods of time. Eradicating that in the fall of 2019 with the first passings of the bills, that was very important. That's something that has been tried by multiple Radas again and again and again, and no one has been able to do that. Of course, he had a majority in parliament and he could push it through. Another major element, certainly when it comes to reforms, the consistency and keeping linguistic and cultural reforms that Poroshenko, of course, started. Language laws, that he did not overturn those, and he has in fact committed to supporting some of these and extending in some cases. Another very important doubling down was decentralization, not only continuing Poroshenko era reforms, but also expanding them in a very particular way. And I think that was very beneficial. Certainly the land reforms. That is again something that time and time and time again, presidents or parliaments tried to get done. In fact, the land reform in Ukraine will be central to Ukraine being able to fully integrate into the European market because of the way that agribusiness is so important within the EU. There's certainly other reforms that are ongoing. The focus is on dealing with judges, dealing with corruption, but certainly also other things that will be central to joining the EU, which is a priority for the reformists in the Rada. And that's a cross-partisan story. That's, I think, the most positive thing that we are seeing in the last year and a half is that the Ukrainian parliament has repeatedly been able to unite across party lines to pass through key reforms. And in this shakeup that we're seeing now with several ministers in the cabinet, we are also seeing that people from so-called different tusovki or networks or cliques are coming into the fold more strongly, and that there seems to be also some back channel bipartisan negotiations to put certain people in these posts, and that is a very positive thing as well. And I think when it comes to domestic politics, the ability to institutionalize this cross-partisan work is going to be extremely beneficial to Ukraine's democracy going forward and its ability to rebuild after the war.
Thank you. I myself go to Ukraine every year, at least try to, and I will say that one of the most visible changes since I was there in 2020 was the repaired roads, the dorohi, which is like a banyan of Ukrainian society. I've been complaining about it since I don't even know. I think before I was born, like dorohi, it's like a big grief of Ukraine, and just coming to Ukraine and seeing them paved, it was like a cultural shock in my own country. But that was just visible. The budget's a big construction. I remember it was a big push. I see a question. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I just wanted to see in your analysis of the Ukrainian society and the data, have you seen any change in societal attitudes towards involvement of the state and the economy? Because, when you look at Ukraine compared to other post-Soviet countries, whether it's to the east or to the west, the percentage of state expenditures at GDP around 40% was probably way above normal. And Zelensky, having come to power, advocated greater involvement of the state, for instance, protesting the healthcare reform. But then, like you said, one of the first things that him and Rada did was allowing privatization of the land in a very limited form. So how does Zelensky generation or this independent generation, do you see any change in the attitude towards the state and the economy?
That's a lot of questions in one. Very good. Yes, of course, some changes. But I think here it's very important. So clearly, there are a lot of things, and several former ministers and perhaps a former prime minister would have a lot to say on this topic here, infamously. I think Zelensky's position on everything from global finance to the economy to the state's involvement in the economy has shifted over this period of time, very quickly, in fact, in the first 2 years of his presidency. It's very clear that there's a welcoming of public-private partnerships, and that the administration is very much in favor of public-private partnerships for any reconstruction and rebuilding initiatives in Ukraine. When it comes to the independence generation, although they share a common socialization, they are in fact from different cleavages and political leanings and views. So they will be very divided on this front, and you can't say that they are more likely to be liberal economically or view that the state should be the central actor in managing the economy. Certainly this is on average, though, a generation that has benefited from types of privatization, and they would like to see more of it. I think more importantly, they would like to see the state's involvement in the building of good roads and schools and hospitals. That hasn't gone away. In fact, we have a survey in the field right now. One of the questions we ask is, what are the priorities for state expenditure? And it's fascinating. We already have the first results from this, and people are very split on what are the things, but they are very clear that it's the state's job to do some things, right? That it can't be just delegated to either international actors or private sector. And that is, I think, once again, we're seeing this developing faith that the state can do this. Because I think part of your shock was that many of us did not believe that the state had the capacity to do these things. But it turns out that, showed this beautifully to everyone, the state is capable, right? And that there are certain blocks that impede this individual's capacity within the state, right, to do certain things. But when it comes to the whole generation, they're a mixed bag, cross-cleavage coalition. Happily, they come together in important moments in time. They view a lot of things differently.
Please.
There are some that say that since Zelensky's career was supported, if not launched by oligarch Kolomoisky, that he's beholden to him. And I understand that Kolomoisky was arrested recently. I just had this conversation with someone very recently who's very emphatic about saying Kolomoisky has a lot of control over Zelensky. And so I told this person I'm going to come to this event and ask this question. And so if, first of all, what's your opinion on that? And secondly, if so, are there any tangible evidence, is there any tangible evidence such as the breaking of laws to support some of Kolomoisky's interests, or the suspension of suspension of laws, or things like that? There's direct evidence that he would be beholden to Kolomoisky.
So no is the short answer, and the longer answer is Henry and I don't have opinions on these things necessarily. We have opinions privately that we will never tell you all, unless you take us for a lot of good drinks. But we follow the data and the evidence and the interviews that we conducted. So we spoke to a lot of people close to Zelensky, close to the administration, in and out of the administration. We spoke to business associates through the years. We spoke to a variety of other people who, other than saying under Chatham House rules, I can't go into any more details thinking about their profiles. And it is very clear to us that although perhaps Kolomoisky thought he could have Zelensky do things for him once he is in power, and perhaps maybe thought that he was using Zelensky at some moments, that perhaps can be the case, it was very clear that Zelensky was using Kolomoisky as well. And it became very clear, we addressed it in the book, it became very clear with his initial actions of very quickly moving against Kolomoisky's interests when it comes to several cases, not stopping them, letting them go forward, other cases coming on board, certainly with recent events. There's nothing to suggest that he is actually under Kolomoisky's thumb. And I think importantly to note that Zelensky was in Odin to Sudan, which is a different channel network, prior to coming to Inter, and then went back with his engineering products to Odin to Sudan. And in fact, there was a bidding contest between these two entities for him. And to say that he was perhaps not friendly, but he was very well known to and knew perhaps rather well several oligarchs would be not even not an understatement, certainly not an overstatement. It's much more that I think when he became president, that first scene of the Servant of the People, I don't know if you remember that first scene where there's three oligarchs standing and looking over Maidan Zelensky, and they're thinking, so who is behind this guy? Is he your guy? Is he your guy? I think they all had a moment like that. And they very quickly realized that he's none of their guys. And I think that was a moment where they all got a little bit scared. Notably, that has there have been tense relationships, tense moments, but also some very I think, reasonable cooperation with several of these so-called oligarchs and businessmen. But there's nothing to suggest and we spoke to people who knew the inside story quite well, and it was a perception. It was also a very clever political campaign. It was a political campaign that was managed by Russian disinformation networks. So there's actually research by political scientists on just that, how Russian disinformation networks were using this puppet of Kolomoisky and the meme. Also by Poroshenko's campaign. Poroshenko was really struggling to put forward a message that was going to work with the median voter. And he had options such as Russian revenge. This is a puppet of an oligarch, and he's inexperienced. All three have so far proven incorrect.
I have a question of my own. Zelensky right now, and you pointed out to it, enjoys like majority unprecedented support in Ukraine despite his reign before the war. He, according to Razan's recent study, is one of the, if not the most popular politician internationally, and enjoys popularity in the U.S. among regular people, sometimes even more than Biden. So there is concerns that such popularity and could be turned into power and advantage for Zelensky. Do you think there is a chance that he will take advantage and basically like become so idealized that turn Ukraine into democracy, authoritarian democracy?
Autocracy that would turn it into, yeah. So, two things. You just said something, we addressed this actually in the book. You said his popularity went down dramatically. And again, we're sticklers for empirical details, and it went down from a very high rate, in fact, the highest rate directly after inauguration of any of his predecessors. But it didn't go down anywhere near to the levels of any one of his predecessors. At the time of the presidency, it went from, so in our own data, this is in the high 50s, low 60s in 2019, to late 2021, around 41% support. It actually dipped in 2020 to about 35%, 35 to 38, depending on how you're doing the analysis. And so his approval rating was higher than any of his predecessors at the same point in the presidency. And so we think that's really important because that already suggested something very interesting. It was an ongoing war, ongoing economic crisis, and the pandemic. We would, as political scientists, expect his rating to drop much more sharply. In fact, we would expect it to drop to at least Poroshenko levels prior, but it did not. So that's the first thing. Of course, there's a rally around the flag effect that we're seeing, and we're seeing massive levels of support and approval ratings continue for the president. What we have found really fascinating as political scientists is that they are not going down, even in the more difficult periods of the war, such as last year in the fall, we were in winter, we were expecting that a hard winter time with many missile attacks would actually affect people's perception of the president and their approval of him. It did not. And he consistently has these high rankings. We just got fresh data back, and it's in 78%. And we do a variety of things, and we talk about this in the last chapter of the book. We look at these things experimentally. I'm not going to go into the boring, nerdy details, but there's things you can do in a survey to try to figure out the real support, right? Because there's going to be a rally around the flag effect, and we know that's going to happen. Who are the people that are simply rallying publicly? And it's about 25% of the population that is saying publicly that they support Zelensky, but privately probably haven't changed at all since 2019. So they have not changed in their position. And that's really interesting, that hardcore, unchanged constituency. But still, that still leaves about 65 to 68% of the general population that would vote for him tomorrow, which would more or less result in the same thing that happened in 2019. It is a worry. there's many things that we're worried about. We criticize Zelensky in various ways in the book, but also we're worried about democracy going forward. We're worried about centralization of power. We're worried about incredibly popular political figures. So far, there's nothing to suggest that Zelensky is the type of character that turns into a Putin. But it's not highly unlikely, though not impossible, right? And so Henry and I have been having these conversations with folks like yourselves, but also between ourselves. What is the thing you're looking for to know this is the problem? We are at an inflection point where perhaps centralization has gone too far, or something else, right? And Henry often responds then to that question, you'll know it when you see it, but we haven't seen it yet. The other thing that keeps consistently coming up in our data, even the data we're collecting today, but also we talk about this in the book, 58 to 62% of the Ukrainian population is ready to protest tomorrow should the situation require it. That's actually the highest rate it was since the Euromaidan in 2013-14. So people are equally willing to engage in protests as they were back then. So Zelensky, I think, is very well aware of this. I think his team is very well aware of this. If he does something that really goes against the popular democratic will of the Ukrainian people, he will face them in the streets, in the steppes, and potentially at his cabinet. Again, I don't think he would be the type to do that, but if he did, we're still quite, we think there's still quite a strong foundation to Ukrainian democracy and civic engagement.
I have a question that's related to what you were just saying. Do you have an impression of how he's approaching the media? I have friends who are journalists there who talk about expectations of what they can and can't cover and self-censorship, and they don't think it's an issue. And then a friend who's a Ukrainian journalist outside Ukraine who said it's hard to tell. What's your impression about how he's approaching independent media? You know, what can and can't be covered during the war, but beyond that, and linked to what sort of leader he'll be longer term.
And again, I think here it's President Zelensky, his administration, people in his administration specifically that might be, in fact, having private discussions with the media. I don't know. For political scientists is a really tricky thing because on the one hand, you understand that in a wartime, political leadership will have to behave in a certain way. There will have to be a certain level of centralization of information. In a democracy, that's quite frankly incompatible, right? But this is not normal times in a democracy. So again, it's one of those things where you're balancing how bad is what is happening and how much of an effect will it have on democracy today, and more importantly, democracy going forward, I think also, right? And I think there are, without speaking to specific events, I think there is some things that could be concerning. At the same time, I don't think we've hit the moment where this is something where we're seeing, someone's Poroshenko's channel, for instance, getting shut down or something like this. I think especially in those early months, the coordination of the media was really important. First of all, the media wouldn't be able to, quite frankly, produce the shows that they were producing if they weren't working together and they weren't coordinated. And secondly, it was very important for clear information to be sent out to the general population. Not everyone is, in fact, internet savvy. Not everyone does use Telegram, even though Telegram might be popular among some. Many people still rely on the television to give them basic information of what is happening, and that's what they did receive in the early months. Whether we need to continue that today, I think that's an open question. That should be a question for Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainian society, and Ukrainian citizens.
Previous elections often, point out this divide that you describe in the book, East versus West. Divide old as the world. especially during the Orange Revolution, that was very obvious. Is it over? Does it still exist? Will it still exist after this war?
So again, in the book, we actually say that that divide never existed in the way people said it did. Unfortunately, this is now for many, many years, social scientists that study Ukraine, both in Ukraine and outside of it, have not been talking about a divided Ukraine. Because if you actually look at the empirical data, for instance, in key elections, you take out the islands in the far west and the far east, Donbass and Kalachina, you start seeing that the numbers of voting patterns start getting very gray and blurred. It's not like you have a very clear progression east to west and so on, right? So even that story about the east-west divide wasn't quite correct from the very beginning. And the things that did divide people were about regionalism, were about some things to do with identity, but they were never about civic identity. They were never about the centrality of attachment to the state, in fact. They were diverse views on the role of language in society. They were diverse views for a time about Euro-Atlanticist policies, but they were not necessarily on those core fundamental things of that I think make Ukraine so incredibly interesting to study and perhaps to live in as well. But beyond this, it's very clear that the 2014 elections and then again the 2019 elections showed that there in fact is no east-west divide and that candidates can speak across geographic poles, right, across geographic locations. And that's really important. That doesn't mean that there weren't key differences that were sowed and replicated by politicians. In fact, whenever we talk about this in the book, whenever a president was doing badly in the polls, they would start turning back to identity politics, oftentimes in a manner that divided the population. Language, for instance, and in fact, it's Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine, that first did this. It looked like he was going to lose, and he talks about Kuchma as this guy who doesn't even know how to speak English properly. And then Kuchma, in the next interview, beautifully responds in perfect Ukrainian, right? It's one of the things, and Poroshenko did this, unfortunately, in 2019. It is the things that they don't work for the median voter in Ukraine. It has not worked so far. It has worked in very particular elections. It has worked, hopefully it won't work again, but in order to win Ukrainian elections, you have to win the center. It's not Kalachina and Donbass that choose who is president. It is the center and maybe the southeast portion of Ukraine. This is the most important constituency. And if you start looking at the elections, every single election since, and we have loads of maps of the elections in the book, you'll see that the colors are not very simply divided. There's a lot of this weird grayness in the middle, and I think that is here to stay.
We have time for one big or two short questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, that's your chance.
I have a super short question. Are there term limits in Ukraine for the presidency?
Yes.
Okay.
Are there what?
Term
limit.
I mean, how many?
Term limit.
How many terms?
2 terms.
Two. Okay.
But infamously, Zelensky said that he would run for only one. He wasn't expecting the context, I think, that he's in right now. I think most people that study democracy would say that him not running right now, if there could be an election, because currently in the context of wartime, you cannot hold an election unless several things will need to change in order for that to happen. So you will know within several months out of an election that it's about to happen. But in the context of wartime, it would be, I think, not necessarily a good thing for him not to run, right? With the power vacuum that it exists. And if citizens decide to re-elect him, that would be on Ukrainian citizens.
So I have last question, unless any more. So as you mentioned before, people were struggling due to all the mentioned crisis, COVID, still low income, et cetera. And it created an impression for Russia that it will be easy to take over Zelensky because he was enjoying such low popularity. What did Moscow did not realize? Why Ukrainians did not support Zelensky yet decided to fight for Ukraine?
It's a very good question, and it's in fact the impetus for the book for many of us. And I don't think it's just Moscow. As I said, it is policymakers in the United Nations, in DC, in London, who we had the opportunity to work with for the past several years. There was a fundamental misunderstanding about who Ukrainians are, what they are capable of, their state attachment, that even when people in the Donbass would report in surveys that they want closer ties to Russia, closer ties to Russia did not ever mean wanting to be ruled by Russia. And if you were, quite frankly, the best word that I can use publicly is silly enough to think that closer ties to Russia means the same thing as wanting to be ruled by Russia, well, then you were really reading into that question quite a great deal. And you should check your biases. But I think that was just a general misunderstanding of Ukrainians. And then for me, it's this shocking misunderstanding when a nation repeatedly joins protests en masse, where you have close to 20 to 25% of the population engage in some form of protest action. When you have this happening across the geographic space of a country, repeatedly, when you have Maidans in Donetsk on the very first night of the Euromaidan, something I've written extensively about, but actually if you want to know about the regional spatiality of Maidans, Emma Mateo is here, she's at Columbia University. You had a lot of this happening time and time again in Ukraine, and you can go back to the history of partisan fighting and engagement, to dissident movements, per capita more dissidents in Ukraine than in Russia during the Soviet Union. There's a long trail here for you to understand that Ukraine has something different in its history. And to miss that repeatedly, you have to be missing it willfully. Or you believe truly something else and through an imperialist lens, like Putin did. But we argue in the book it's something actually more important. It wasn't that they were underestimating Zelensky as much, is that they thought that they were going to get more of a Yanukovych than somebody that was going to wheel and deal with Russia, someone that was going to give in, someone that could be manipulated. Perhaps he is just an actor and comedian, right? He wants negotiations and peace. He says it repeatedly in his campaign, which we think was quite frankly a naive position to hold when you say that. It was realizing after his election that he is not, in fact, Yanukovych 2.0, that he is not going to just wheel and deal with Russia and let himself be controlled by it, that then it became very clear that the other option needs to now be taken. Because all of a sudden, Ukraine was moving to a consolidated democracy where the guy that came into power did not simply overturn all the policies and laws of his predecessor, but in fact expanded some of them. And a lot of them were seen as potentially dangerous to Russian imperialist ambitions in Ukraine. And I think that's part of this equation, underestimating Ukrainians repeatedly, but also initially underestimating Zelensky and then realizing you're not getting what you thought you were going to get.
Thank you. Very short, yes.
Як ви бачите, що президентські вибори можуть відбуватися в військовий час? Це є недопустимо.
So the question was, could it be possible that elections could take place in the wartime context? And yes, according to the law, that cannot happen. So це неможливо. Але є процеси, які можуть відбутися, щоб можна провести вибори. І це дуже багато людей тепер думає і говорить. So it is possible there's certain processes that can take place, certain laws that can be passed to enable elections. There are people in a lot of places around the world, in cities around the world, but specifically in Kiev, thinking about how, if at all, would this be possible. There are folks, and Henry talks a lot about this when he's here at the presentation. There are folks that are thinking about types of e-voting and so on. There's a lot of clever people trying to figure out if it's possible. I personally think that elections during a wartime context are highly divisive and potentially polarizing, and you need to maintain civic unity. And I don't, as a democracy scholar, I don't know if that would be the way to go. But again, this is not up to me. This is up to Ukrainian citizens and leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you, our audience, for participation, for interest. You may not like it, but I invite everyone to talk to you if you have any questions, and also invite everyone to get a book if you don't have one downstairs, and use this unique opportunity to get it signed by the author. Thank you once again, and meet you at future events, Razum and the shop.
No, it's good.